Well, good afternoon. I'm sorry we're running a couple of minutes late with some technical difficulties, but I wanted to thank you all for coming in to our panel on how state leaders, conservatives in the states are really leading the way on criminal justice reform. I don't know how many of you saw the panel this morning called Prosecutors Gone Wild, but it was a big hit. We had a lot of people applauding. We had a lot of people really engaged, and I'm glad to see you all in the room this afternoon. So let me make some introductions here. To my right, we have Ronnie Lampart from American Legislative Exchange Council, who's the Director of Criminal Justice Reform Programs.
Yes, Criminal Justice Task Force.
The Criminal Justice Task Force, I apologize. And next over, we have Representative Julie Emerson from the great state of Louisiana.
They're both in Louisiana.
Yes. Yes. Oh, that's true. Yes, we have the Pelican State overrepresented this afternoon. Next to Julie, we have Mark Levin from Right on Crime. He is the Director of Public Policy, Director of Policy for Right on Crime. And at the end is Pat Nolan, the Director of the Center for Criminal Justice Reform at American Conservative Union Foundation. And it looks like we have well-deserved round of applause. It looks like we have our technical difficulties worked out, right? There we go.
As recently as 2007, our Legislative Budget Board projected that Texas would need 17,000 new prison beds by 2012, at a cost to taxpayers of roughly $2 billion.
When I came into office, the state's correction system population was rapidly increasing. In fact, since 1990, the state's prison population had more than doubled to nearly 56,000 inmates. 1 in 13 adults in our state was under some form of correctional control. At this rate, the prison population was projected to grow 8% over the next 5 years, costing us $264 million additional dollars.
It's no secret our prison population is in a crisis with over 61,000 people under the jurisdiction of corrections. Our prisons are way over capacity, and our prison population is expected to grow by 25% over the next 10 years. Oklahoma's overall incarceration rate is the second highest in the country.
Because for a long time, criminal justice here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky has not been as effective as we would hope it to have been.
With broad support from Republicans and Democrats, Texas changed course. We implemented common sense policies that may not only make Texas tough, but also smart on crime. We shifted our focus to diversionary programs like community supervision. We passed legislation allowing nonviolent offenders access to treatment and vocational programs, proven to reduce recidivism.
In 2012, the General Assembly and I enacted reforms to focus prison space on serious offenders, all while creating programs such as drug courts to reduce recidivism.
So that is why I created the Oklahoma Justice Reform Task Force to find data-driven, smarter on crime policies to focus on improving public safety.
I want to announce the creation, the formation of the Criminal Justice Policy Assessment Council.
We haven't reinvented conservative philosophy. We've just applied basic conservative philosophy to criminal justice. Government accountability, fiscal restraint, personal responsibility, the promotion of work, and the strengthening of the family. These are values that work for other core functions of government, and we're showing that they also work in criminal justice.
Influenced by core conservative principles, this solution not only improved public safety, but gave offenders a second chance.
Now, there is unprecedented conservative support on this issue from groups like the American Conservative Union.
The purpose of this is how do we best serve everyone in Kentucky? Because a properly functioning, effective, safety-providing, opportunity-providing, rehabilitation-providing criminal justice system, when operating well, benefits every single person in the Commonwealth.
The results have been extraordinary. Texas crime rate has dropped to its lowest point since 1968. And during my leadership, Texas crime rate shrank by almost 24%. For the first time in history, Texas is closing prisons, not building new ones. As a matter of fact, we've closed 3 units since 2011. This approach has saved Texas taxpayers $2 billion. Other states have the power to achieve similar results.
Thank you. I got to tell you that watching those clips really excites me, and it does, because there are some longtime conservatives involved in criminal justice reform, and there's some young rising stars there. And so it is just thrilling to see everybody start to understand just how important it is. But for those of you who are new, and I think I want to pose it to the panel, when folks think about conservatism, they think about tax reform and regulatory reform, and they don't necessarily think of criminal justice reform. And so I just want to, before we get into what's going on in all the states, how does justice reform play into those conservative philosophies that I think most people in this room share? I think I'd throw it open and start with Pat, if we could.
First, public safety is by far the most important responsibility of government. If we can't keep our people safe, government is failing us. The question is, how do we do it at a reasonable cost? You know, the liberals never met a program they couldn't expand and make everlasting. In fact, Ronald Reagan said that the closest thing to eternal life on this earth is a federal program. So how do we do it within the confines of fiscal sense? How do we hold it accountable for keeping the public safe and for valuing the values of society, family, a clean living life, a good working job, responsible citizenship? All those things are part of a good prison experience. If it's just warehousing and then releasing, we've spent a lot of money and haven't changed anybody. I was blessed to work for 20 years with Chuck Colson, and one of the things he said, he had a great way of hitting right at the heart of a matter, was he said any nation would have to be rich and stupid that continued to pour billions of dollars into a system where offenders' behavior was unchanged, victims' needs were unmet, and the public still lived in fear of crime. And yet, with all the money, $80 billion we spend now on prisons, our people still are in fear. Victims' needs are often ignored completely. And offenders' lives aren't changed. You have 40% return to prison for a new crime. That's a failure rate of 40%. If you went to a hospital where 40% of the time you were still sick after you were released, you'd find a new hospital. And that's what conservatives have done. We've said, let's look at what we're currently doing and try to do it better. How do we change offenders' lives? How do we involve victims more in the process so they feel not only protected but also recompensed for the harm that's been done? And how do we make our people feel safe? And we've done that beginning with Texas. Mark here was the genius behind some dramatic reforms in Texas. This is now the 10th anniversary of those reforms. So could I pass it to Mark?
Hey, well, thanks. That's a great introduction. But yeah, in Texas, we really hit a fork in the road in 2007, and we had to decide kind of if we were going to spend what was projected billions of dollars to build 17,000 new prison beds. That's what lawmakers were told by the Legislative Budget Board we would need by 2012 just to keep up with population trends, more people being sentenced to prison, serving longer. And ultimately we said we need to distinguish the people we're mad at from the people we're afraid of. And prisons are for people we're afraid of, not for people with a drug problem. So we set about developing a plan to expand drug courts, expand treatment and other alternatives to incarceration, reduce the probation caseload so a probation officer could really supervise someone, preferably with swift and certain sanctions as well as positive incentives for good behavior. You know, you think about, we have these situations on probation where someone keeps missing meetings and they just wait till all these violations pile up and then they're revoked to prison, go to prison for 10 years. Well, if you had a child and they were touching the stove, you wouldn't wait for months for them to keep doing it and then come down like a ton of bricks. You would say, okay, you missed this appointment on probation, now you have a curfew, now you have electronic monitoring, now you have a weekend in jail. By the same token, letting people earn their way off of probation by going above and beyond really excellent performance over a year or two, and all the data shows the chances of them committing another offense are minimal. So that way we're actually supervising the people that are at a risk of doing something wrong. So Texas, as Pat alluded to, we've seen a decline in our prison population of about 14%, a decline in our crime rate of about 29%. So over this last decade, it really has been a story that's inspired Georgia, South Carolina, Alaska, South Dakota. There's so many states, mostly under conservative governors, which is a point you probably saw there, because I truly believe it's conservatives that have the credibility on this issue. Ever since, you know, Michael Dukakis gave that answer in the debate about the death penalty, and of course the whole Willie Horton thing and all of that, the public doesn't trust liberals, starting with basically in the 1960s, where liberals were, you know, saying if it feels good, do it. Society causes crime. There wasn't a real sense of personal responsibility. So conservatives are uniquely situated, and they've been taking advantage of that to lead the way in this area.
Hey guys, I'm proud to come to you today from the bayous of Louisiana. Happy Mardi Gras, by the way. It's Tuesday. You know, I represent the Boudin capital of the world, which is Scott, Louisiana. That's B-O-U-D-I-N. If you don't know what that is, Google it, and don't judge me for eating it. But unfortunately, Louisiana is also known as the prison capital of the world, and that's not something that we're as proud of. Our incarceration rate is the highest in the world. It's twice that of the national average, 13 times that of the whole nation of China. And, you know, I think that a couple of decades ago there were a lot of things that went through Louisiana to be tough on crime. And I think we all want to be tough on crime. We want to make sure that, you know, you do the crime, you do the time. But at the same time, well, now there's overuse of time, but we want to be smart on crime. We want to make sure that we're not just doing the same thing over and over and over again, because that's the definition of insanity, right? When you do the same thing over and over again, you expect different results. I'm relatively new to this issue. I was just elected in October of 2015, sworn in January of 2016, and got introduced to this issue pretty early on through a mutual friend. And it's been a very interesting thing for me to be a part of, because when we have a lot of fiscal issues in Louisiana right now. We just got out of special session the night before I flew here to cover another budget deficit. And when you look at the amount that's spent on corrections, it's between $500 and $700 million in the last several years, which to a state like Texas is not a big deal, but to Louisiana, that's a pretty big deal. So I think that it stems from that initially of fiscal conservatism, but then when you also look at the other things that we're involved in from a standpoint of family values, we want to be able to put these individuals back with their families. We find that there's a lot of dads. You have a lot of single moms out there where the dads are in prison, the children don't get to interact with their fathers as much, so we want to get them back a part of their family, and we believe in redemption. Look, we don't want violent criminals roaming the streets, but for the lesser crimes, you want to be able to give those individuals a chance at redemption. And I think for me, that's where the conservatism kind of comes into play, and also just my Christian faith of believing in redemption as well, as Pat and I were talking about earlier.
Ronnie, you have anything to add?
Well, going last, I could certainly add something, but so much has already been said and so much I absolutely agree with. In fact, I was a prosecutor in New Orleans, born and raised there, so again, I will say happy Mardi Gras. I do not come from the boudin capital of the world. I know, I should have, but then I could have thrown them out, and we could have, anyway. So, as a former prosecutor in New Orleans, I would see oftentimes the types of offenders that Representative Emerson's talking about. You have the ones who are not a threat to public safety, who are, have a drug problem, and then you have those who are violent and deserve substantial punishment. But at the same time, the costs of incarcerating individuals who are nonviolent and not a threat to public safety does not serve the public interest. So with these initiatives that ALEC has had for I'd say over 5 years now, we've sought to offer alternatives to incarceration similar to what the state of Texas did for these nonviolent offenders. And it turns out in a lot of states this is working, and that's why you have now other states like Oklahoma, like Louisiana, who this year will consider justice reinvestment initiatives. Last year, Maryland passed a justice reinvestment initiative along with Alaska. So there's a lot of action going on in different states, and these states are realizing that there are better options than just locking people up and throwing away the key for, again, certain types of offenders. Certainly, violent offenders deserve to be away from society. That's what prison is for. But for nonviolent offenders, there are certainly better alternatives.
This morning, I think Pat summed it up really nicely when he said we should be locking up those people that we're afraid of, not those people that we're merely mad at. And so Ronnie hits the nail on the head. Can you explain briefly what justice reinvestment, the JRI, is? Yeah.
Okay, we're doing this is like a fantasy football draft where we're zigzagging.
We're going to go back and forth.
Right. So justice reinvestment, it's each state, the way they go through this, a state will form a task force of individuals from all aspects of society, really, especially in the law enforcement community. So you'll have a representative of the prosecutors, the public defenders, sheriff's association, police departments, all up and down the line, and they meet and they convene and put together recommendations for the state legislature to adopt. And the research is done by usually an outside group, and they take the data and realize, okay, this is what would work here, this is what we recommend, and they implement those recommendations, and oftentimes that gets put into legislation the following session. I believe the recommendations in Louisiana, correct me if I'm wrong, are set to come out in March, and the session in Louisiana starts April the 10th, right, the regular session, not the numerous special sessions. So once a state goes through this process, they pass or don't pass the bill, but these bills have passed in various states, in many cases in very red states. I don't know how much more red you can get than Texas, and now Oklahoma is considering it this year. But in states that are very different geographically and demographically. You look at Maryland. Maryland has a lot of rural areas, but then they have Baltimore. Baltimore is a high crime area, and they still passed the Justice Reinvestment Act last year as a result of the collaboration between individuals in the law enforcement community and individuals in urban areas and rural areas. So this absolutely can be done. It has been done in numerous states, and it looks like, fortunately, it will continue.
Julie, you coming from Louisiana. Oh, Pat.
I just wanted to explain to you the significance of Ron and his organization. It's the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a group of conservative state legislators from all 50 states, funded by themselves and working together to find solutions. It's a perfect example of federalism, of each of the legislators bringing to the table, being part of this organization, their experience at working at these problems and then sharing ideas and developing model bills. And Ron's emphasis on criminal justice reform is such a blessing to all of the legislators in all of the states. It's essentially a clearinghouse for conservative ideas. In general, conservative legislators don't get the backup from the establishment, let's say the government bureaucracy. They can always come up with ways to spend more money and expand government power, but to come up with ideas that save the public money and yet keep them safe, oftentimes it has to come outside the bureaucracy. And ALEC does it on a free enterprise basis, and it literally is a blessing to the legislators and to those of us working on these type of reforms. So it's really an honor to have Ron here with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can go to the ALEC website and find dozens of model policies on lots of different areas, but including criminal justice. So there's a safety valve for mandatory minimums. There is, swift and certain sanctions for people on supervision, which I talked about earlier. A model bill to end civil asset forfeiture, which you heard discussed by Senator Cruz earlier. Default mens rea provision, so people can't be convicted of a crime without an intent element. So these things are all cataloged on the ALEC website as model policies that legislatures can and do take back and then customize to their own states. Because I do want to emphasize one of the things about justice reinvestment is you spend a year with a task force or commission delving into the data of who's going into prison and for what and how long are they serving and which programs are working, which ones aren't as far as rehabilitating various offenders. And every state's a bit different. So I remember when we did some work in Delaware, they have no county jails, it's all one state system. So it turned out they were going to have to build another women's prison to lock up prostitutes at a state prison. And of course they were serving for 6 months on average and coming out and going right back to prostitution. It wasn't working. We actually have a program in Dallas that gets women out of this occupation, so to speak. But former prostitutes who abandoned that lifestyle are now doing great, work with them. And so you can get people out of these types of things, but just having a revolving door doesn't do it. So, but the point is every state is a bit different in terms of who's going into prison for what. But as has been stated here, I think the first step is you look at nonviolent offenders, people that are low risk, people that don't need to be incarcerated. You make them worse by actually locking them up. Because when someone comes out, especially from a short jail stay or prison term that's several months, that's not enough time to get much of an incapacitation benefit, but it's enough time for that person to lose their job, in many cases lose their spouse, don't have a place to live, and once you have a felony record, and even more so once you've been in prison, getting a job is very difficult. And we've also advanced record sealing, where for example, if you've had a drug conviction many years ago, shouldn't you be able to eventually get that off your record and not have this scarlet letter hanging over you?
Julia, if you can touch a little bit on your proposals in Louisiana. And before you do that, I just want to kind of call out Representative Emerson because she was one of the few Louisiana legislators to win the ACU's Conservative Achievement Award in her first year in office.
Thank you, guys. It was a tough few sessions to be a conservative. So.
Well, I mentioned in the beginning that we're excited about having, some of our longer-term conservative leaders pushing criminal justice reform, and some of our kind of young guns, the up-and-coming, the real stars on the rise, and Julie's one of them. But if you can talk a little bit about the proposal you have in Louisiana and maybe some of the unique challenges that you have in Louisiana with respect to getting that ball across the line.
Sure. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about some of the reforms that we passed through last year in my first session coming in. And like I said, I'm a little bit new to the ball game when it comes to justice reform. So it was a little bit scary at first, I'm not going to lie. I'm looking through some of this and I thought, wow, this is, in my mind, probably like a lot of you, I was thinking this is not a typical conservative thing to get on, but apparently these guys have been doing it for years and we're late to the game. I didn't know that. But last year we did pass through a lot of reforms that were really focused on reentry. So basically, when you are coming out of prison, what are your opportunities like when you get out? Are you going to have job opportunities? Have you had training while you're there? Is an employer going to be receptive to you coming out of prison, even with job skills to do that? So we tried to make that a little more open. So one of the biggest bills that we did was called Ban the Box, and we just did it on the state level for state employees. We were not trying to encroach upon private business and employers' thought process and their ability to hire. But what we did on the state level is to say, do the application, do the job application, and get to the interview process before you start looking into the backgrounds and the criminal backgrounds. So that way, at least you have a shot that when you look at the application, they don't say, okay, we're just going to file that away in the trash, and you never get a chance. That was probably the most difficult one to pass. It had failed many times in the past, and we brought it through, and we got some conservatives behind it. And when we went into committee, again, it was a bill that had failed for several years before that. And we get in there, and honestly, it was the very first bill I had ever given testimony on as a legislator. So, and I'm also the youngest legislator in Louisiana, so that was a little bit scary as well, going in there, trying to give testimony on that. But my background is a little bit more as far as giving speeches and everything, speaking in churches and doing some youth events, things of that nature. And so I just wrote a sermon for them, basically. And I got in that committee, and I'm just going after it about redemption and giving people second chances. And this is a really good opportunity for a piece of legislation that'll really make a difference in people's lives. And I think some of my male colleagues were like, "Who in the world is this, and where did she come from?" But it worked, and it passed out of committee 9-1. A lot of my conservative colleagues supported it. When it got to the floor, a little bit more difficult. We passed it through with 53 votes, which we have 105 members, so you need 53 votes to pass something. But by the time it got to the Senate, a lot of our friends at Justice Action Network had come down, and I think Mark may have been down there, or some guys from Right on Crime. I'm just kind of helping with that message, helping people understand. So we do have some unique ability to build some coalitions, Republicans, Democrats, faith-based community, men, women, young, old. This is an issue that is really across the board. It doesn't, it can touch a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And I think, especially in Louisiana right now, as we're going into a fiscal session, so we're set up a little differently this year. We can only run fiscal bills, and then we have the ability to do five non-fiscal bills. So, not that anyone really cared about that, but I'm setting this up for you a little bit. So this year we're going to focus a lot on money issues, and then the governor has announced that criminal justice reform will be the secondary issue that he deals with. So, I think a lot of my conservative colleagues get a little bit of heartburn when we start talking about some of the fiscal issues, because that probably means a lot of tax bills. But this is something that we've really been able to work with the governor on and have a bipartisan effort. So I think you'll see a lot of really good reforms coming out of Louisiana this year. I know the task force is going to announce some of their findings in a couple of weeks, and I'm excited about that, and I think you'll see a lot of great things coming out of our state this year.
We've seen in the past circumstances where some law enforcement folks, some prosecutor folks have an instinctive reaction to oppose criminal justice reforms at the state level. But Louisiana has kind of an additional challenge there, right? In terms of how the parish sheriffs work and the per diem behind it.
Sure. Yeah, so everyone gets a per diem per prisoner, basically. And so I think that sometimes you worry about the funding, and I think from their standpoint, they do have to look at a budget on their level, in fairness to them, and say, okay, well, if we have this reform and we have people serving less time or whatever it may be, then there is some concern about the prisons and how they'll be funded. And so that is an additional challenge, certainly. We were blessed in my area that we had some of our sheriffs on board with this, and our Secretary of Corrections has also been really interested and has been on the task force. Many people from his department have been on the task force to put through some of these reforms. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to work together on that.
Can I just answer real quick? I mean, government programs in general create constituencies for them. And another example is big labor, which for many years obstructed sentencing reforms in Michigan and California, even held protests. So for example, when California, the three strikes law, much of the support behind that came from prison guards unions. So, I mean, we as conservatives have to say, let's have the prisons we need for public safety, but not one more as a job creation program for any union or anyone else. I mean, I feel sorry for people that You know, and I'll tell you, we've actually had success with the prison staff. With Texas, we don't have unions, we don't have collective bargaining. There's a staff association of prison guards, and they've actually realized and joined our effort in saying we don't want to build more prisons because they realize they're never going to get a raise, they're never going to get better working conditions. By the way, our prisons aren't air conditioned, but they're never going to get better working conditions unless we have fewer prisons, because every time you build a prison and you have to operate it in inmate health care and staff health care, it takes everything away out of the budget. So, we do have to be concerned that with the sheriff system and your sheriffs in the parish jails there, and that's where half the Louisiana inmates are in the parish jails, they are getting money from the state, and they're dependent on that money even to pay off the bonds for those jails. So it creates a dependency that's hard to get out from under.
That's a very good point Mark is making. I'm originally from California, and the California Correctional Peace Officers Association was the second largest PAC behind only the doctors, the California Medical Association, as far as campaign dollars. So they packed a lot of wallop. But there are subtle ways in which the unions make it difficult too. I was with Prison Fellowship for 18 years, and part of that program is going into prisons and working with the inmates as volunteers, organizing inmates, volunteers to go in. There's a lot of resistance from the officers because they view the volunteers as scabs. They're not very smart to think this, but they think if there weren't the volunteers, the department would have to hire more employees. So these volunteers are taking their jobs, they think. And of course, that's ridiculous. As Mark said, any new money is not going to go to the staff. But there is opposition to the point where most prison systems have a rule called the non-fraternization rule that says that someone who's had a relationship with an inmate inside the prison is not allowed to be in contact with them when they get out. Well, mentoring is by far the most effective way of helping an inmate stay on the right path when they get out. And yet, this union rule prohibits them from doing it, makes it a crime to do that. And the Bureau of Prisons, for instance, at the federal level, when I told Congress about that, immediately both Democrats and Republicans were incensed. And they sent their staffs in the back room, drafted an amendment that specifically prohibited that rule from being in the Bureau of Prisons. It still has not been implemented. When did the Second Chance Act pass? What, 07 or so? It still hasn't been implemented. Why? Because the Bureau of Prisons said it's a bargainable issue, and they haven't been able to reach agreement with the union on it. So it's still prohibited to have an inmate in contact with a volunteer, even though the volunteers are helping make safer communities. Dr. King said, to change someone, you must first love them, and they must know that you love them. Government programs can't love people, but volunteers can. And that's what is expressed by these volunteers and mentors. And yet, the unions fight it and try to oppose it. I might also add, volunteers are no cost, whereas the employees cost quite a bit. So I just wanted to put that in. That's this crazy upside down world that we live in, where volunteers are pushed away when they could be making such a difference in the inmates' lives.
Let me pivot just a little bit, because I think it's pretty clear that having the large number of people in federal and state prisons has a huge budgetary impact, something like $80 billion, right? It works out to be about $260 for every person in this room. But I want to pivot a little bit to the family cost, if I can, because I think, you know, as conservatives fall into, you know, various groups, whether you're a fiscal conservative and a budget hawk, or you're concerned about the scope of government and government power, there's also the family side of things, and so I'd like to just ask your thoughts on how the family is taken into account in all of this, and the values and the challenges when we're talking about married offenders with children, and where there are opportunities there as we talk about reform.
Well, two of the issues that I think are really important in this area that we're working on a lot now, that we haven't discussed, are fines and fees in the criminal justice system and pretrial justice, which includes people being held in jail prior to their trial before they've been convicted of anything. And, you know, when it comes to fines and fees, the recent research has found 2/3 of these criminal justice system fines and fees are paid for by the family. So it's typically the wife or grandma or whoever is trying to pay for this. And, you know, I don't have an objection to someone paying probation fees to help cover the cost of their probation. The problem is there's places where if you're indigent and you truly can't afford to pay, you can be revoked from your supervision to prison just because you don't have the money. And then now we're paying as a society to keep that person behind bars. It doesn't make any sense. And on the pretrial side, you know, I think we need a system that, you know, certainly there's nothing wrong with having commercial bail in some places, but also jurisdictions are saying, okay, if you're low risk, if you're, let's say you were arrested for a small amount of marijuana, even if you don't have the bail, you shouldn't, the money, you shouldn't stay in jail just for that reason. So it's kind of creating a balanced system where we recognize that, you know, as a free market person, I'd be the first to say there's nothing wrong with being able, that I can afford a nicer car than somebody else, a fancier home or something. But when it comes to justice, that it ought to be blind to somebody's ability to pay. So we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions. One of the examples, by the way, is suspending people's driver's license. So in Texas, we're trying now to get rid of the driver responsibility program, where if you have like 3 speeding tickets over the course of the year, you lose your driver's license unless you can pay a $2,000 surcharge. And by the way, all these fines and fees like civil asset forfeiture, it creates another revenue stream for government. It's a way to grow the size of government. But I think when you look at it, I mean, someone needs to be able to use a car to go to their job. Now, if you're a repeat drunk driver and you're in danger with a vehicle, absolutely take away your license. But just because you can't afford to pay something, that's not right. And actually, there's legislation in Congress which should actually address the federalism part of this, where the federal government has said, we're going to cut off highway funds to states if they don't suspend driver's license for a drug conviction, even a possession of a small amount of marijuana. And this ought to be a state issue. Why is there the federal government, it's our money, holding it hostage over an unrelated policy? So there's a lot we need to do in these areas, but again, it gets back to if dad can't drive to his job, that hurts his wife, it hurts his kids, so this has a cumulative impact on the family.
Pat? Oh, I'm sorry, Ronnie.
And there's so many issues impacting the family. A lot of prisons are built in rural areas, but the offenders come from urban areas. And to have to drive 7 or 8 hours to get to the prison for visitation essentially eliminates visits from the family. Oftentimes it's a spouse or a girlfriend or an aunt or grandmother taking care of the kids. They're often working 2 jobs to be able to support their own family and the offender's family. And after putting in, you know, hours and hours each week working 2 jobs, who has the energy to drive 7 hours up to visit their loved one in prison? And how can they afford a motel and the gas? I mean, that's just wrong. And we should be building the facilities as close as possible to where the families come from. Now, some people say, oh, well, they must come from a bad family, you know, because they got in trouble. That's not really true. Obviously, there are some families that have bad issues, but there are a lot more that don't. And God created the family unit as the basic instrument of His will on the earth. The family unit is intact. And all of the studies show that an intact family is more help to an inmate after release than any other factor, by far. So the more we can do to keep that precious bond of the family together. But instead we put the loved one hundreds of miles away, We charge for telephone calls absurdly high amounts. It's cheaper to call Indonesia than it is to call from a prison to a family in the United States. It's just absurd. Oftentimes, it's $15 to connect the call, and then $3 a minute for the call. Now, who pays that amount? You know, Wall Street Journal wrote an article that prisoners are the last people paying full retail for phone. And oftentimes, this is the only connection between a parent and a child. When I was in prison, I would talk to my children. My wife would send in the books they were reading, and we'd talk about the books and go over their book reports. Well, if they were at the absurd charges that a lot of prisons have, we never could have done that. And frankly, there's a lot of business of a family. You know, you're in prison and your income is down to 17 cents an hour. What bills do you pay? What bills do you put off? Things like that, you've got to go over on the telephone, and yet you're paying these exorbitant rates. And then let me tell you one other thing. And this is just one of many decisions that is outrageous. Many prison systems, a majority of them, shackle women prisoners during childbirth. If you can imagine the barbarity of that act, and yet they are, even in states where we've had efforts to prohibit it, they still do it. Now, it's on the theory that, well, men are shackled because men can fake an illness and work with a Confederate that would lynch them from the hospital. Well, you know, anybody that's been with their wife during delivery knows that's not going to be likely. They'll jump up off the gurney and escape. Also, they can't fake a pregnancy. Either that or the medical staff is really pretty ineffective. There's an armed guard with them in the room, and yet they're manacled and shackled, hand and foot, during childbirth. Now, that is just cruel, and it should be stopped. And yet, systems do it. The majority of prison systems do that. It's a terrible way to bring a child into the world, and it's just emblematic of the attitude they have towards parenting and children in prisons. And that's just one. I can give you other examples, but to me that's the most outrageous one. And yet the majority of prisoners are subject to that.
From a legislative standpoint, I can tell you one of the most important allies that we had in Louisiana was the Louisiana Family Forum. And their president was asked several times, what does it have to do with anything that you're doing? Why are you coming after this issue? And he said, I mean, it's hard to get any more family values than putting the family back together. So, I would just echo everything these guys said about it's so important to have that family bond. And when you're getting out of prison and in re-entry, if you have your family with you, they're supporting you, it makes all the difference in the world.
I know we only have a couple of more minutes left before we've got it looks like we're getting about a 2-minute warning. Let me just take 1 minute to ask you all for help, because this is a big issue, and we are working to build a greater grassroots capability. And we need your help, just like the family groups in Louisiana have been helping Representative Emerson. If you look up on the screen, you will see some of our contacts. If you will follow us on Twitter, if you will like us on Facebook, we have a website that we have just revamped, revitalized, that has a lot more information to help people who might want to talk about this issue in their civic groups, in their Bible study, to call their representatives, to call their legislators. We need all the help we can get because it is a tough issue. It requires a lot of explanation. But at the end of the day, whether you are a free market conservative, a small government conservative, a budget hawk, or a pro-family conservative, all of us should have an issue with the way the criminal justice system is working now. And the only way we're going to change that at the state level is going to be with your action. So if you guys can take a minute and do that, we would be greatly appreciative.
Could I just add something? Because we have several of our great staff here in the room who you can talk with as well, Joe, Dan, Derek, but we're hiring for 2 more positions. We're shorthanded now. So if any of you are interested in actually getting into this work or know someone who might be, please check out our website, texaspolicy.com, rightoncrime.com.
And also just a little plug, Sidney Powell, the author of License to Lie, who was on the panel this morning, has some of her books outside. There will never be a book on prosecutor abuse that lays out a clearer picture of what happens. The bad prosecutors, not the good ones, but the tactics that they use. She'll be out and back and consign them for you and sell them to you. And I just want to emphasize what David said. This is one where these are issues, criminal justice reform, where conservative legislators, frankly, agree with us, but they are afraid the public isn't with them. So hearing from you and your thoughts is so helpful. Everett Dirksen, the great senator, said, "When I feel the heat, I see the light." And you can help enlighten them and basically give them permission to speak out and become active on behalf of reforming our system. Reforming our system so the public is safer and the taxpayers have more of their money. Thanks.
I'll be brief, but if everyone's going to have plugs, I should have one too. So if any of you are interested in discussing these issues further with myself, I'm happy to do that. We have several other ALEC staffers here. It's my cheering section over there and in the back. So also our website has all of our model policies listed. And if you have any questions about any of them, first off, check them out, but then follow up with me, rlampard@alec.org. And I'm happy to help and answer any questions to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Thank you. Ronnie, Julie, Mark, Pat, thank you for your help. Thank you for your leadership.
Well done. Thank you, sir. Yeah. Ronnie.
Oh, hi.
Chad from New Orleans.
Oh, you're from New Orleans.
Lakeview. Yeah, and we moved to Covington and now have moved up here.
Okay.